Hi, I'm Matt Hernandez, and this is Book Chat with You. In almost every episode, I try to make the episode be a conversation with you about, well, at least now, about short stories. Today, we're looking at Joan Updike's short story, Twin Beds in Rome. Down below, you can find a link to a PDF of the story, and you can find a reading and commentary on the story by the New Yorker. So just like the last one, also in the New Yorker. And this story, Twin Beds in Rome, is about a couple, Richard and Joan Maples. Now, I did not know this, but apparently there are about 18 stories with these characters. And these stories, you could mostly read them apart from each other. But if you had not read the other ones, you wouldn't know that this married couple has kids. It doesn't mention that at all. Now, what this story is about is Richard and Joan Maples, they take vacation in Rome. And it seems that they've never been there before. They don't speak Italian, and they're surprised by how well so many people speak English there. They get to their hotel, and instead of having one double-sized bed, they just have two twin beds. And they're not even like next to each other. And they're kind of like okay with that. This couple, though they might make passionate love, they're quite sick of each other. And there's this kind of nagging feeling from the husband where sometimes he just makes complaints. And his wife has a bit of a maternal attitude towards him. I take that phrase a bit from the New Yorker podcast, which, I'd like to make most of my comments from myself the best I can, but they mention that. And as I reread the story, you can see it quite a bit. This describes some beautiful scenery there, right? There's tons of fountains everywhere, tons of beautiful churches that they pass by. But then we hear quite a bit about Richard Maple's aching feet. And I don't know if that's ever an element in the other stories or if he just has a tendency to have something somewhere somehow just gnawing and aching at him because, he's a bit of a whiner. And it's his wife who is very, empathetic, sympathetic to his needs, to his desires, despite all of his incessant whining and complaining and stuff. So in the story, not sleeping inside the same bed with him needing a warm body next to him to help him sleep. She tells him in the morning how he had been sort of talking in his sleep and whatnot. And they buy some new shoes for him. His feet are aching. They need a taxi back to their hotel. They can't quite say how to get back. He complains about being ripped off. He complains about all the tipping and that kind of thing. And that's essentially the story, I kind of like reading these stories that don't have some of that clear story arc, I do need a refresher in various parts of story, analyzing it and these things, but it is nice to read some of these stories that are absent of some of that because some of these things might better reflect real life. And that too is beautiful in its own right. Well, I do have quite a bit of comments to make, but maybe I will read 3 short passages from this short story here on my tablet, and we can discuss it. So, Richard Maples tells his wife, as I'm reading here, "You are such a nice woman," he said. "I can't understand why I'm so miserable with you." He said this, or something like it, so often before that she, sickened by simultaneous dose of honey and gall, ignored the entire remark and unpacked with a deliberate sincerity. So what that first comment kind of tells me is that he's egging her on for a fight. And, maybe I'm still self-censoring a bit of making these videos and such, these podcasts, because I do want this to be an invitation, but I can't help but to say that this quality is not, it's a quality I might expect a bit more from a wife. And if you feel otherwise, please let's discuss these things. But it does feel like he's egging her on for a fight a little bit here. What else could this be? It's like, I don't know why I'm so miserable. And why would you say that? Why would somebody say that? Like, way off in another country. Like, what is this? Okay, here's another one. That is, Richard assumed in the cavernous accounting rooms of his subconscious that Joan also slept well, But when they awoke in the morning, she told him, "You were terribly funny last night. I couldn't go to sleep. And every time I reached over to give you a little pat, to make you think you were in a double bed, you'd say, 'Go away,' and shake me off." He laughed in delight. "Did I really, in my sleep?" "It must have been. Once you shouted, 'Leave me alone,' so loud I thought you must be awake. But when I tried to talk to you, you were snoring. Isn't that funny? I hope I didn't hurt your feelings." "No, it was refreshing to not have you contradict yourself." This actually reminds me of a kind of story my colleague told me about another colleague and that type of thing. And yeah, it reminds me of this, but I'm not sure I can say it. And it just, it's so ingrained into him that him simply knowing that he was sleeping in his own bed when they were both concerned if he could even sleep in his own bed. But once that became clear, like, don't touch him. It's that ingrained into him. And it does seem like the issues are more on his side, right? And it's like the older one gets and more mature, it's like we should all understand some responsibility of what we have done to cause an issue, right? But in this case, it doesn't seem like there's two to tango here. It seems like the issue is more on just one person. Okay, here's another one. And not knowing why. "Shall we go back to the hotel?" "Yes. I think if I could lie down." "Shall we get a taxi?" "They'll cheat me." "That doesn't matter." "I don't know our address." We know sort of. It's near that big fountain. I'll look up the Italian for fountain." "Rome is full of fountains." "Richard, you aren't just doing this for my benefit." He had to laugh. She was so intelligent, not consciously. "It has something to do with having to hand out tips all the time. It's really an ache. It's incredible." "Can you walk?" "Sure, hold my arm." "Shall I carry your shoebox?" "No, don't worry, sweetie." As I read this, I I do think a bit about how people say that maybe fiction is not as educational or something like that. I do see part of this as educational because wherever we go, we are still ourselves. We do not change into just something else, maybe with the environment. And I could argue the contrary as well. I mean, for me to move to another country, in many ways, it has made me grow and develop in many ways. But there are other aspects that it doesn't change everything. And just because you go somewhere else, like, I think we're all told that traveling is so great and wonderful and all that. You can go to any library or bookstore. There's so many books on travel, but it doesn't change so many other things. And there could be things that you might find annoying too. I mean, living in the country that I'm living in now, tipping is not common by any means. And then whenever I go back to the US, I'm going to have to relearn how to tip and all that stuff. So it is quite telling. But yeah, other than that, all I could really just keep saying is just about how much the relationship is on such a downfall. And it is also quite telling because oftentimes, if you imagine some kind of marriage counseling situation, we're all supposed to see how we are responsible ourselves for what's going on. But sometimes, like this, kind of seems like, Richard Maples is the one kind of at fault here. And I've not read the other stories in this collection, I could say, which they were all written far apart. But I mean, at some point, it was all published as one collection about the Maples couple and that kind of thing. Well, with all that said, I think this podcast has been long enough, but I would love to hear what you've had to say. I don't think I've posed as many questions back to you as I often do, but there are tons of things that we could discuss here. I mean, have you encountered some of these things, being ripped off by taxis and the like? I mean, we certainly were worried about that a little bit when I was in the Navy, but of course, in the Navy, when you get like 4 ships going to one port inside of a small city, all the taxi drivers know where the ships are at. But some of these things are concerns, too much walking. For me, the biggest thing I'd want to do would be to walk. But there are tons of things that we can discuss here, and this video is probably long enough, and I would love to hear what you have to think and say and all that. Thanks. Bye.